I was there for 2 years, and I think it was one of the more interesting periods in my life because it was kind of like an incubation period. Is when I really decided what I wanted to do with my life. And the university at that time had the Ring Theater, which I still think they have, and that theater really got me indoctrinated into the world of acting. And
Sylvester Stallone built one of the most improbable and most genuinely inspiring careers in the history of Hollywood. A man who arrived with nothing but an idea, a typewriter, and an absolute refusal to be told what he was worth, and who turned that refusal into one of the most commercially dominant and culturally resonant bodies of work that popular cinema has produced in the last 50 years. Rocky was not simply a film. It was a declaration of creative identity so complete and so personally rooted that its success changed everything about how the industry understood the relationship between a performer's vision and the machine built to contain it. He created franchises from sheer force of will, rebuilt careers that the industry had written off, and demonstrated across decade after decade that the qualities the system most frequently underestimated, stubbornness, personal intensity, and almost irrational commitment to a specific creative vision, were precisely the qualities that endured longest. But behind the legendary performances and the indestructible public persona, the reality of working alongside Stallone in certain professional contexts was considerably more complicated than the mythology of his resilience suggested. Certain collaborations carried tensions that went deep, lasted long, and left marks on the industry conversation that decades have not entirely erased. But not every collaboration went smoothly. Here are 6 actors they reportedly had serious tensions with. Starting off with number 6, we look at one of the more quietly persistent and specifically documented tensions of Stallone's working career, his reported friction with Dolph Lundgren during the production of Rocky IV in 1985. The casting of Lundgren as Ivan Drago, the imposing Soviet heavyweight, whose physical dimensions and cold mechanical authority were designed to represent everything that Rocky's human heart was positioned to overcome, was itself an acknowledgement of something extraordinary about the Swedish actor's physical presence. Lundgren was not simply large, he was, at the precise moment of Rocky IV's production, one of the more genuinely imposing physical specimens that the action film landscape had encountered. A man with a master's degree in chemical engineering and a martial arts background of serious depth, whose combination of intellectual formidability and physical extremity made him a genuinely unusual presence in any room he occupied.
The production of Rocky IV was, from its earliest stages, an undertaking driven by Stallone's personal creative vision with an intensity that left very little negotiating room for anyone else's instincts about how the work should be done. Stallone was directing, writing, and starring simultaneously, the triple responsibility that gave him complete authority over every creative dimension of the film, but also placed him under a level of sustained pressure that shaped the atmosphere of the production in ways that everyone working on it felt. The specific tension with Lundgren was rooted, by accounts from people connected to the production, in the physical reality of what the film required. The training sequences and the fight choreography demanded a level of genuine physical engagement between the two men that was, by Stallone's own subsequent account, more consequential than he had fully anticipated. Stallone has spoken in various retrospective contexts about a specific incident during the production in which Lundgren's physical engagement during a filmed sequence was of sufficient force to require Stallone's hospitalization, his heart reportedly swelling from the impact in a way that necessitated medical attention. Whether this was the result of a deliberate disregard for the safety parameters of the scene, or simply the product of Lundgren's extraordinary physical power operating within a production environment that had underestimated it, is something that the accounts of those present have described with varying emphasis. What was consistent across those accounts was that the incident changed the working dynamic between the two men in ways that persisted across the remainder of the production, creating an interpersonal atmosphere that was, by multiple descriptions, considerably more strained than the fraternal mythology of the Rocky franchise typically suggested. The experience of working within a production organized entirely around Stallone's creative authority, while also being the physical presence required to genuinely threaten him within the film's narrative, was a challenge that Lundgren navigated from a position of significant professional vulnerability, a newcomer to a franchise whose entire identity was the personal and creative property of the man he was required to oppose on screen. The tension between those structural realities and the personal dynamic that the physical incident created was something people close to the production noted as a defining feature of Rocky IV's behind-the-scenes story, and one that those who worked on it have consistently described as more complicated than the film's triumphant surface ever revealed.
At number 5, we arrive at a tension that played out on one of the more entertaining and underappreciated films of Stallone's filmography, the reported complications in his working relationship with Wesley Snipes during the production of Marco Brambilla's Demolition Man in 1993. Snipes was cast as Simon Phoenix, the anarchically violent and psychologically unpredictable criminal whose release from a cryo prison sets the film's central conflict in motion, a role that offered him extraordinary material and that he pursued with an investment that went considerably beyond the conventional requirements of a mainstream action villain performance. His preparation for Phoenix was immersive and physically transformative, and he brought to the role a creative energy of genuine intensity that made the character one of the more memorable action antagonists of that era. The reported tension between Snipes and Stallone was described by people connected to the Demolition Man production as rooted in a creative and personal dynamic that generated friction relatively early in the shoot and sustained itself across the full course of a production that had other challenges to manage simultaneously. Snipes' creative approach to Phoenix was deeply and specifically internal in ways that created a working atmosphere around his performance that was not always compatible with the more pragmatic and outcome-focused professional culture that Stallone's productions typically generated. The specific character of the reported friction touched multiple dimensions of their working relationship, the calibration of their shared scenes, the tone and energy of the production's daily working atmosphere, and the interpersonal dynamic that exists between a franchise star of Stallone's established stature and a performer of Snipes' independent creative conviction inhabiting the same large-scale production. People who worked on Demolition Man described moments during the shoot where the working dynamic between the two men required active management from Brambilla and the production team, where the specific friction of their contrasting creative energies created challenges in the shared space of scenes that required a precise and sustained antagonism between their characters. The deeper dimension of the reported tension was rooted in the fundamental asymmetry of their creative positions within the film. Stallone as the franchise star whose authority over the production's direction was informal but comprehensive, Snipes as a performer of genuine individual creative conviction whose instincts about Phoenix were specific and strongly held and did not always find comfortable accommodation within the working environment Stallone's presence naturally generated. The finished film's considerable entertainment value owes something to that real-world friction, visible in the charged and genuinely unpredictable quality of Snipes' performance against Stallone's more settled and confident screen presence.
Coming down to number 4, we arrive at one of the more complex and layered working dynamics of Stallone's later career, the reported tensions that developed between him and Jet Li during the production of Sylvester Stallone's The Expendables in 2010. The Expendables was, from its conception, one of the more ambitious exercises in nostalgic action casting that Hollywood had attempted, a film built on the premise of assembling the most significant names in the action genre's history within the same narrative, generating the kind of gravitational spectacle that multiple generations of action audiences would respond to. Stallone was the architect of the project in every meaningful sense, its creator, its director, its star, and the creative intelligence behind its conception and execution, and his vision for how the film should function and what each performer within it should contribute was comprehensive and specific. Li was cast as Yin Yang, one of the film's ensemble of mercenaries, and brought to the production a creative investment and a professional seriousness that were the product of a genuine martial arts background of extraordinary depth and a film career of considerable international significance. His approach to the physical demands of the role was built on foundations of real discipline and real expertise that went considerably deeper than what the film's genre conventions required, and the specific working dynamic this created with Stallone, whose own background in physical performance was genuine, but whose relationship to the martial arts tradition that Li represented was necessarily of a different character, generated a friction that people close to the production described as persistent and noticeable throughout the shoot. The reported tension was rooted by accounts from people connected to The Expendables in the broader challenge of a production built around Stallone's comprehensive creative authority, attempting to accommodate the individual creative identities of a cast of performers, each of whom carried significant stature and specific expectations about how their work would be treated. Li's specific friction with Stallone was described as touching the question of how his character's capabilities would be presented within the film, the concern that the martial arts expertise he was bringing to the role would be underutilized or misrepresented in ways that did not serve the authentic tradition he represented. For Stallone, whose narrative and directorial priorities were organized around a specific vision for the film as a whole rather than around the individual creative satisfaction of any single performer within the ensemble, accommodating those concerns within the constraints of a large-scale commercial production created challenges that the working dynamic between the two men reflected with consistency. It was a tension rooted in the fundamental difficulty of a strong individual creative identity finding its place within a production organized entirely around another person's equally strong creative vision.
At number 3, we look at what is perhaps the most widely acknowledged and most specifically documented long-term industry rivalry of Stallone's career outside of the single most famous one, his reported friction with Bruce Willis across the period of their professional intersection, and most pointedly within the context of the Expendables franchise and its complicated ensemble dynamics. Willis was among the most commercially significant action stars of his generation, a performer whose Die Hard franchise had established a specific and enduring template for the wisecracking, reluctant American action hero that was culturally distinct from the more overtly muscular and physically imposing model that Stallone represented. The two men inhabited the same commercial genre from positions of genuine equivalence for an extended period of their careers, and the comparison between them was a consistent feature of the industry conversation about both throughout that era. The reported tensions within the Expendables franchise between Stallone and Willis were described by people connected to those productions as touching multiple dimensions of their working relationship. The question of creative control within a production that Stallone had conceived, developed, and organized around his own specific vision was one persistent thread. Willis's own considerable professional authority and the specific demands and expectations he brought to his participation in the franchise were not always naturally compatible with the working culture that Stallone's comprehensive creative ownership of the project generated. Multiple accounts from people connected to the Expendables productions described a working dynamic between the two men that was more fraught and more specifically contentious than the nostalgic celebration of the franchise's marketing ever acknowledged. Stallone's eventual and relatively public expressions of dissatisfaction with Willis's engagement with the franchise, communicated through various channels with a directness that was unusual for professional disputes of that scale, reflected a level of genuine frustration that people close to the productions confirmed was rooted in real and documented interpersonal difficulty. The reported tension between two performers of equivalent commercial stature, each carrying strong convictions about how the professional environment around them should function, created a working atmosphere within the Expendables productions that those managing them found genuinely demanding. It stood as one of the more openly expressed professional falling outs of Stallone's later career, and its specificity and its visibility in the public record make it one of the more fully documented of the tensions covered here.
At number 2, we arrive at the most extensively analyzed and most comprehensively discussed professional rivalry of Stallone's career outside of number 1, his decades-long and deeply complex competitive dynamic with Arnold Schwarzenegger, which began as a straightforward commercial rivalry between the two most dominant physical action stars of their era, and evolved over many years and through specific and documented professional intersections into something more complicated and more personally significant than the term rivalry adequately captures. Stallone and Schwarzenegger occupied, across the 1980s and into the 90s, the two most commercially and culturally dominant positions in the action film landscape, each representing a different but equally compelling version of the genre's physical and narrative possibilities. Stallone's Rocky and Rambo franchises had established one model of action heroism, emotionally vulnerable, physically extreme, rooted in a specific American working-class mythology that carried genuine personal resonance for the man who had created it. Schwarzenegger's Terminator and Commando era had established another, more openly cartoonish, more comfortably superhuman, built on a physical impossibility that the audience was invited to delight in rather than identify with. The comparison between those two models was the defining question of mainstream action cinema for a significant stretch of both careers. The competitive awareness between them was, by accounts from people who knew both men during that period, something that shaped their behavior and their creative decisions in specific and documented ways. Stallone has spoken in various retrospective contexts about monitoring Schwarzenegger's projects and their critical and commercial reception with an attention that went beyond casual professional interest, an acknowledgement that the rivalry was real and that it occupied a genuine and sustained place in his thinking during the years of its most active intensity. The specific instances of professional friction between them, the negotiations over roles each was aware the other had considered, the comparisons generated by productions that occupied similar commercial territory, and the industry social dynamics of two men who were simultaneously rivals and the mutual guarantors of each other's continued relevance within the genre each had defined, were described by people who observed them as a persistent and genuinely complex feature of both careers. The evolution of the rivalry into the collaborative gesture of the Expendables franchise, where both men appeared together in what was marketed as a celebration of the genre they had jointly dominated, brought the complexity of their professional relationship into a new and revealing configuration, one that people connected to those productions described as carrying the specific kind of carefully managed tension that only very long and very complicated histories between strong personalities can produce. The warmth was real, the history behind it was equally real, and considerably more complicated than the genre's nostalgia circuit typically acknowledged.
And now we arrive at number 1, the most extensively documented, most personally significant, and most historically embedded of all the difficult professional relationships in Sylvester Stallone's career. This is the story of his relationship with Richard Gere, a rivalry of such specific intensity, such long duration, and such consistent documentation in the accounts of people who knew both men and moved in their shared professional world that it has achieved a kind of legendary status within the industry's historical memory that makes it genuinely unlike any of the other tensions covered here. The Stallone-Gere dynamic is, in certain important respects, the most completely documented example of sustained mutual professional antipathy between two major Hollywood stars in the modern era. It did not arise from a single incident on a single production. It was not the product of a specific creative disagreement that escalated into something broader. It was, from its earliest documented origins in the 1980s, a comprehensive and mutual personal and professional disregard that touched every dimension of the way each man understood and responded to the other across decades of parallel careers and occasional forced professional proximity. proximity. The origins of the tension have been attributed by various sources to multiple possible sources: competing interests in roles and productions during the period of both men's early Hollywood prominence, fundamental personality contrasts between two very different kinds of public masculine identity, and the specific competitive awareness of two men who each understood the other's cultural positioning as existing in implicit commentary on their own. Stallone's public persona was built on a quality of working-class physical directness, the self-made man whose resilience was written in the specificity of his physical performance and the autobiographical rootedness of his most significant work. Gere's persona operated from an entirely different cultural register, a certain polished, spiritually inflected, aesthetically sophisticated masculinity that was almost deliberately constructed in opposition to everything Stallone represented in the cultural landscape they shared. The reported personal friction between them was something that people who encountered both men in shared professional settings described with a consistency and specificity that spoke to something genuine and deeply felt rather than a media construction. Stallone's comments about Gere in various interview contexts over the years have been, by the standards of Hollywood professional diplomacy, unusually direct. Characterizations of Gere's approach to his work and to their shared industry that communicated genuine and sustained personal feeling rather than the careful equanimity that most performers maintain about their contemporaries in public settings. Gere's own responses to those characterizations were, in their measured tone and studied indifference, equally communicative about the character of the real-world relationship between the two men.
The most specifically documented and most widely discussed flashpoint between the Stallone and Gere dynamic was the reported tension surrounding their shared appearance at the Academy Awards, an event whose protocols required them to occupy the same professional space in ways that the specific character of their relationship made genuinely uncomfortable for both men and for the people managing the logistics of the ceremony around them. Accounts from people present described an interpersonal atmosphere between the two men that was charged in ways that the ceremony's carefully managed public presentation could not entirely contain, and that spoke to the depth and the genuine feeling behind a professional antipathy that had by that point been building across years of parallel careers. What makes the Stallone-Gere dynamic the most significant entry in this account is not simply its intensity or its duration, but what it reveals about the broader dynamics of Hollywood's competitive landscape at its most unfiltered. Both men were, in their very different ways, products of the same system, performers who had each built careers of genuine and lasting significance through qualities that the industry's conventional wisdom might have suggested were insufficient. The specific and documented mutual disregard between them was, in its own way, the most complete and the most personal expression of the structural reality of what it means to build a creative identity in a world where your value is constantly assessed in comparison to the value of someone who occupies the same cultural territory from a completely different direction. The rivalry was real, the feeling behind it was real, and the fact that it outlasted multiple decades and multiple shifts in both men's cultural positioning speaks to something in its character that went considerably deeper than ordinary professional competition. But not every collaboration turned into conflict. Among the working relationships Stallone built with genuine warmth and creative satisfaction, two stand out with particular and consistent prominence. His creative partnership with Rocky and Creed director Ryan Coogler during the Creed productions represented a genuinely energizing late-career collaboration that Stallone has spoken about with real and unguarded enthusiasm. A working relationship in which a younger director's complete creative authority over a franchise Stallone had built gave the older man a quality of creative freedom and human perspective that produced some of the most personally affecting work of his later career. Coogler's understanding of what the Rocky mythology meant and his ability to extend it in ways that honored its original spirit while genuinely renewing it gave Stallone a professional relationship built on real creative trust. His longtime friendship and professional partnership with director John G. Avildsen, who directed the original Rocky and whose understanding of what Stallone was attempting to build with that story was complete and deeply generous, represented the foundational model of creative collaboration against which everything else in Stallone's professional life was measured. People who knew both men described a working relationship of genuine mutual investment and real personal warmth that shaped the best work of Stallone's career at its most essential level.
The professional life of Sylvester Stallone, examined across its full and extraordinary arc, is ultimately the story of a man who refused to accept the industry's assessment of his limits and who paid the full and specific cost of that refusal across decades of genuine creative struggle. The tensions explored here were not incidental to who he was. They were the inevitable product of someone for whom the stakes were always personal, always specific, and always too high for anything less than the complete honesty of a real and unguarded human response.